Once again, the best known strategy for a perfect duotrigordle has changed. If you don't know what a perfect duotrigordle is, I'll explain quickly. Duotrigordle is a Wordle variant in which you have 32 simultaneous Wordles to solve. A perfect duotrigordle consists of solving a duotrigordle in a perfect 32 guesses. In other words, every single guess has to solve a board, without exception. Now obviously, this challenge involves a good amount of resetting so that you get the first word correct. Therefore, you're going to really want to optimize the odds of getting past the first few guesses so that you can get more good attempts. This begs the question, what's the best word to start with? Well, we've been trying to answer this question for a long while through many different methods. Before we get into the current best known answer, let's go over a brief history of best known strategies and the methods used to find them. At the start, players would choose words based on how many common letters they had. Some examples of words from this time include stale and later. A and E are the most common vowels by a noticeable margin, and S, L, T, and R are all very common consonants. Intuitively, this method makes sense. If your word has common letters, you're more likely to get yellows and greens, which means more information overall, which means a better chance of getting more words, right? Well, sort of. This was a good way of finding pretty good starting words, but once we started doing more rigorous research into this question, this method didn't quite hold up. Next, we started looking at the number of guaranteed follow-up words after a given starting word. That is, the number of patterns that a starting word could produce that can only lead to one valid answer. Here's a quick example. If one of your boards gets this pattern after guessing stale, then the answer to this board has to be sweat. Thus, we say sweat is a guaranteed follow-up to stale. When we measure guaranteed follow-ups, we are looking at how many of these words exist for a given starting word. By this metric, the top words ended up being brute and chant, which both had 39 guaranteed follow-ups. For comparison, stale had 34 guaranteed follow-ups and later had 33. These were interesting results. I mean, chant only had one vowel, and brute had a U instead of an A. Furthermore, brute has a B and chant has an H, which aren't exactly the most common letters. It seemed that our intuition wasn't as great as we first thought. Now, at this point, we had only been looking at optimizing the second guess, but duotrigordle has a lot more than just 2 guesses. It was still relatively common for runs to die on the third guess, since 2 words still isn't a whole lot of information. Thus, our attention turned to guaranteed follow-ups on the third guess. Given a correct first guess and a guaranteed follow-up second guess, which word would have the most possible guaranteed third guess follow-ups? Well, as it turns out, it wasn't brute and it wasn't chant. The word with the most guaranteed follow-up third guesses was in fact metro. Intuition was completely out the window now. There's an M and O instead of an A, and why is the O at the end? That is not a common place for an O to go. But regardless, the numbers don't lie, and metro was indeed the best starting word in Perfect Duotrigordle. Or so we thought. Now, you read the title of the video, so you already know that none of these words are the current best known first guess. It turns out this whole time we'd been overlooking something very important. Maybe we didn't look at enough guesses. I mean, there's 32 guesses and we only looked at 3 of them. Surely that's not enough. Well, as it turns out, the amount of information you get after 3 guesses is usually enough to get you to the end of the run. Besides, the amount of time it takes to apply these metrics to deeper guess counts just isn't worth it. Every new guess checked multiplies the amount of possible paths by 2,315, which is how many answers are on Duotrigordle's answer list. Past 3 guesses, the space of possibilities is just too large, and the time it takes to run code is too long. So if it's not more guesses, what were we missing? Well, at this point, we'd only been looking at guaranteed follow-ups. But what does a player do if they don't get one of these follow-ups? Do they just reset? Of course not, that would be a waste of a perfectly good attempt. Instead, they try to find a coloring that has the least amount of potential follow-ups, and guess one of the possible answers. That is what we were missing. You see, hitting a 50-50 or a 33-33-33 and so on is a perfectly viable way to get a run past the first few guesses. By ignoring that, we were missing out on one word that was actually better than all the words we'd found thus far. So how did we account for this possibility? We broadened our scope to all possible answers by making one assumption: that the player would pick a random answer from whatever coloring has the least amount of possible answers, and thus the highest odds of getting an answer right. Doing this, we can then calculate the chance of a given coloring being chosen by the player. I want to clarify what I mean by chance in this case. Remember, the player is not picking a coloring at random, they are picking the one with the least possible answers. However, the other colorings on the board determine if a given coloring actually gets picked by the player. For example, this coloring here has one follow-up, and this coloring here has two follow-ups. If both of these appeared on the same board, the player would always choose the first one. But if that second coloring appeared on a board with no guaranteed follow-ups, the player would choose that one instead. Since the boards themselves are random, we calculate a chance of a player choosing a given coloring. Now that we have these chances, we can multiply them by the chance of the player actually getting the word right for each coloring. Now, for each coloring, we have the odds of a player picking that coloring and guessing the answer successfully. All that's left to do is add these probabilities up to get the complete odds of a player getting the word right on their second guess. After doing this process for every starting word, we finally found our new best word. That word is FILET. At this point, our previous intuitions had been proven to be almost entirely incorrect. We have an I instead of an A, and F is the least common letter that's appeared in any of these words yet. But what about that third guess? If you remember from earlier, once we expanded our search to 3 guesses, our best word changed from brute enchant to metro. Does FILET still hold up if we expand this search to 3 guesses? Let's find out. For this search, our colorings will consist of 2 words, which means we need to account for each coloring of each pair of starting guesses. Thus, for each pair of starting guesses, we calculate the odds of a player picking each coloring, and multiply that by the chance of the player actually guessing correctly. This time, there's one more step. We also need to factor in the odds of the first pair of guesses actually happening in the first place. For example, if your starting word is FILET, guessing feast as your second guess is going to be much more likely than guessing fancy. Feast is a guaranteed follow-up to FILET, so if it's on your board, it's almost always going to be your next guess. Meanwhile, fancy shares a coloring with 23 other potential answers. If a player was to guess fancy as their second guess, they must have had a pretty terrible board, and even then, they'd only have a 1 in 23 chance of actually getting it right. Therefore, colorings that consist of both FILET and feast are much more likely to occur than colorings consisting of FILET and fancy, and we need to account for this. Thus, once we have the probability of the player choosing a coloring and guessing correctly, we then need to multiply that by the odds of that pair of guesses actually occurring. Finally, we can add up all these probabilities to get the odds of a player getting their first 3 guesses correct with a given starting word. After doing this, FILET remains on top with an almost 54% shot of getting the first 3 guesses correct. Metro does show up again as a close competitor, but FILET still holds a solid lead. And that's it. If you're interested in trying the Perfect Duotrigordle challenge, I would highly recommend making your starting word FILET. Save yourself some resets by giving yourself the best odds of success on every attempt. Hey! Before I do the obligatory YouTuber plugs, I want to give a huge thanks to Little GWS. He's the one who did all this research, and this video would not be possible without his efforts. Speaking of this video, if you liked it and want to see more, it would be really appreciated if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. The reception to these more scripted videos has been really positive, and I'm glad you all seem to be enjoying them. Anyways, that's all for me. See ya.